you know, in today's society, there's a common misconception of who we are as people, right? Especially, in the United States where we have the color code race classification system. And there's a good book about the color code race classification system that was written by Dr. Christopher Martin Stansel, Ill. It's available on Amazon. Very good book. And we'll probably even touch on that in a deeper podcast in one of the longer podcast segments. But because of the color code race classification system in America, we have an identity crisis. And for example, many of us go by, if you consider yourself to be Mexican or Chicano or whatever, you can go by you say, well, I'm Hispanic or I'm Latino or I'm Chicano or, right. These are all different labels, that have been placed upon us, whether we placed it upon ourselves or somebody else placed it upon us. These are labels that were placed upon us in order to describe us, but it's not who we are. You get what I'm saying? Another example, we live in relatively young countries, right? So the United States has only been a country for 290 something years, right? And Mexico is even younger than that. We know that there was kingdoms, nations, and empires that lasted a whole lot longer than just a couple hundred years. Take the Roman Empire, for example. It's one of the most famous empires known in modern times. I believe it was around for, close to 1,000 years or just under like 800 years or something like that. And there was empires that were around for a lot longer than that as well, and less than that. So, but in relative time, if we're looking at time as far as how old the country is, we live in relatively young countries. So when we say that we're proud to be Mexican or we're proud to be American, what does that truly mean? You get what I'm saying? Yes, be proud to be Mexican. Yes, be proud to be American. But does that describe who we are as a people? For example, take the state of Morelos in Mexico, right? We just take the name, for example, Morelos. It's just the name of the town. It's just the name of the city. It was named after a person. That's what we believe. That's what most people know. It's just named after somebody, right? In all actuality, the word Morelos finds its root in old Spain, right? And in old Spain, it was a word that diluted to, or that also was synonymous, excuse the delude, but it was synonymous with the term or the word Moor, right? So you might ask yourself, well, what does Moor have to do with Mexico, right? So this is, I started the Mexico, the Moorish Connection, part of the Project Baby and Me podcast to kind of take a walk back through history. You get what I'm saying? So we have to start in the most recent history in order to get back to older history. So I'm not going to dive too deep into too much details just because this is a short, but I will be having podcasts where we take certain subjects and just dive deep into it. So I just wanted to throw that out there. We don't know. We identify terms with ourselves that we don't even know what those terms truly mean. We haven't done the research or to find out, what does it mean? What does Hispanic mean? What does Latino mean? What does Chicano mean? Who created these terms? Who created these labels? What does black mean? Negro mean? Colored, Ethiopian. What do these terms mean? Yellow man, brown man, redskin. All these terms. That's not who we are. But these are the terms that we have identified as over the years. Believe it or not, the term Negro came from the term Indian, right? Indian, we already know that's not who we are because they say, oh, we landed here, we thought we saw Indians. And we're going to get to that too. We have to think about, we were told in our history books that there was a conquest for the New World, right? They were exploring. They wanted to find new stuff to explore, the city of gold, all these things that we were told. But one thing that the logical thinker has to think is why? One, if they didn't know it existed previously, why would tons of ships show up on the shores of South, Central, and let's take out North America for right now, but South and Central America with a massive army? Oh, they call them conquistadors, right? The logical thinker is saying, why? If you never knew this place existed, why? Why wouldn't you just send an explorer? Get what I'm saying? So we're gonna delve deep into that, you know. And one of my biggest things is I'm an advocate. I'm an advocate for unity between so-called black and so-called brown, and even go as far as to say unity between, you know, so-called descendants of Asia as well. You know, we all have common ancestors, and so our fights have been the same. And this is me trying to show you how our fights have been the same, and we have been taught, and we're learning a hateful behavior that we've been practicing for quite a while. Because 100 years ago, a lot of this wasn't secret. You know, this was happening, you know, a little over 100 years ago, if not less than that. You know, so, you know, going back in, you know, one of the things that I wanted to bring up in this little talk is one of the things that's largely left out of our history books is the fact that Mexico played a key role in the ending of slavery in North America, or in the United States of North America, a key role. And this is something that's been largely omitted, left out of history. Now, was that the end game of Mexican forces? I don't believe that was necessarily the end game, but that's what came out of it, because Mexican revolutionists, they were looking for equality in Mexico as well. And the plight of, you know, the slaves and the descendants of the slaves in America was the same as those who were in Mexico, who were under the same duresses, maybe had more freedoms, but were under the same duresses, so to speak. You know, landowners were getting their land taken from them. I mean, there's a whole bunch that we can dive into. But I just want to touch briefly, because I don't want to spend a whole hour talking about it right now. But, you know, on a later date, we'll dive deep. You know, Texas used to be a part of Mexico, and we're going to have a podcast on this too, on Texas and their stance on slavery, and how they've always had a very slavery friendly stance, both when they were a part of Mexico and then again when they were a part of, you know, the United States of North America. But a lot of enslaved Africans found freedom in Mexico. And this isn't largely known. It's history that's not really taught on both sides of the fence, you know. But, you know, a lot of enslaved Africans found escape in Mexico. They were able to be free in Mexico. And this is dating all the way back to, you know, the beginning of the country of Mexico, because previously before that, it was called the Empire of, or what they would say was the Empire of Mexico, but was called by, you know, New Spain as New Honduras, which we know, when I say New Spain, most people go, oh, well, that's what Mexico was called. Well, I say that for a reason. And when you have the European Spaniards that showed up on our shores and masses, a whole army amassed, you know what I mean? Things that they say, oh, our ancestors never saw these things before. Think about it. If you think about how when they first landed in Peru, we weren't worried. Our ancestors weren't worried. Why? Why weren't our ancestors worried? Why did they not worry about all these people in shiny armor with muskets and swords if they had never seen it before? They weren't worried. They didn't think them as a threat. So if they didn't even think them as a threat, we also have to think, if they weren't a threat, were our weapons really that primitive? Think about it. They say disease is what wiped most of the indigenous population out. So let's just I'm gonna read an excerpt from a book called Black and Brown by Gerald Horne, and this is the story of how enslaved people found freedom in Mexico. And in 1832, Carl Christian Beecher, who was a German journalist, I believe, compared the legal status of Afro-Mexicans, with African Americans. And these, he said, quote, "These blacks, as is known, are free in the Republic of Mexico, which is to say they enjoy intimately the same rights as do the rest of the inhabitants of the state, which is not the case in the United States of North America, where, as a result of the laws or for prejudices, the blacks are humiliated and pressed down to the category of the lowest level of men." And this is in 1832, almost 50 years before slavery was abolished completely in the United States. And slavery at the time in 1832 was already largely being abolished in Mexico. Texas, this is why I had brought up Texas earlier. Texas was, and those parts of Mexico, which included, like California, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, Arizona, New Mexico. These parts were also a part of Mexico at the time, but Texas was like the forefront of the South in America, and you know what I mean? And for the United States of America, there was a lot of European colonists and settlers who came to Texas who embraced the idea of slavery. And the power of the United States of America was a lot stronger than the power of the Republic of Mexico back then. You know what I mean? So they were able to largely just continue to do whatever they wanted. So largely, slavery wasn't fully abolished in Mexico until, Texas and the rest, until Texas succeeded as its own country for like a year. And then, obviously they were backed by the United States. If you go dig deep in, and we'll take that dive on a podcast. But, until they were like a year or two, I think, their own country, and then they joined up with the United States. Then you have the Mexican-American War, and what came out of that was, Mexico lost pretty much a lot of its territory, a lot of its land that was in what is called North America. And that's where you go into like the revolution, right? When you look at the Mexican Revolution, like, yes, it started over land ownership and stuff like that. Yes, that's basically how it started. And then the landowner, the president who was elected, right? Homeboy Diaz threw him in jail. Porfirio Diaz, I believe, was his opponent. He threw him in jail, and that basically sparked the whole revolution because of the things that were, a lot of the descendants of the old Spain, which are also the descendants of Africa, were enduring under, these Spanish Royal Army loyalist leaders. You get what I'm saying? So they passed the Colonization Act of 1824. And I know I had previously said, I don't know if I even published the video yet. I have a whole lot of these little snippets, but I had previously said in one of the videos that it was the Constitution of 1821. I was wrong. It was the Colonization Act or Law of 1824 that stipulated that all slaves in Mexico would be free on their 14th birthday, basically in Texas alone. You know what I mean? But in the European colonial settlers in Texas, man, they didn't want that. You know what I mean? In 1832, Vicente Guerrero was president, and Anastasio Bustamante was vice president. Anastasio Bustamante ended up overthrowing, in a rebellion, he ended up overthrowing Vicente Guerrero. You know what I mean? But he went on to be president of Mexico, I believe, 4 or 5 times. But he's controversial. Some will say he was good for the Republic of Mexico, and some will say that he was a traitor, and he always was a traitor because he was always a loyalist to the Royal Army of Spain, which, if you do your history there, then you know that was the Catholic Church. And Rome, basically. So in I want to say 1932 or 1930, somewhere around there, there was a former slave by the name of Felix Hayward, who said there was no reason to run up north. All we had to do was to walk south and we'd be free as soon as we crossed the Rio Grande. In Mexico, you could be free. They didn't care what color you were, black, white, yellow, or blue. Hundreds of slaves, in fact, thousands, literally thousands of slaves, did go to Mexico and got on all right. We would hear about them and how they were going to be Mexican. They brought up their children to speak only Mexican, or what we would call Mexica, Nahuatl, Mexica, Mexican, Spanish, Nahuatl, right? So this, believe it or not, it was largely still spoken widely back in the 1800s, Nahuatl and other native tongues. Some of them are still spoken today. You get what I'm saying? Quechua is one of them. Quechua is the native tongue of my ancestors, from Peru. A lot of freed slaves, right? A lot of enslaved slaves who chose to be free, and instead of trying to run north, they knew they go south. As soon as they cross the border, they're free. A lot of them ended up fighting in the Mexican Revolution. And believe it or not, the Mexican Revolution at times crossed over with the American Revolution. Or the American Civil War, I would say, not revolution, the American Civil War. So you had the American government or the North, right? Fighting two fronts. They were fighting the Confederacy, and then they were also fighting the revolutionists down in Mexico and the southern border and out west, right? And then you had Mexico also fighting on two fronts, fighting, their own government. Then they were also three fronts, really, because they were fighting the Confederates, the Confederacy as well, and those Confederates that were still in Mexico at the time. And they were fighting against the United States government at the time as well. So like I said in a lot of these videos, our plights have always been the same. There's no difference in our plight. We're the same people with the same ancestors, and we come in all shades of skin. I just want to read an excerpt, another excerpt real quick, and it's called The Origin or the Divine Origin of the Asiatic Nations. It says the fallen sons and daughters of the Asiatic nation of North America need to learn to love instead of hate, and to know of their higher self and lower self. The key of civilization was and is in the hands of the Asiatic nations, the Moorish, who were the ancient Moabites, the Egyptians, who were the Hammatites and a direct descendant of Mizraim, the Arabians, the seed of Hagar, Japanese and Chinese, the Hindus of India, the descendants of ancient Canaanites, Hittites, and Moabites from the land of Canaan, the Asiatic nations and countries of North, South, and Central America, the Moorish Americans and Mexicans in North America, Brazilians, Argentinians, and Chileans in South America, Colombians, Nicaraguans, and the natives of San Salvador in Central America, etc. The Turks are the true descendants of Hagar, who are the chief protectors of the Islamic creed of Mecca, beginning from Muhammad I, the founder of the uniting of Islam by the command of the universal God. Now, I didn't read all of that in its entirety. I did skip over some parts, but you get the gist. And going from there, this is why it's so important to know who you are. Really, it's why it's so important to know who you are. And that's how I started the video. There's a big misconception in this world, especially in the world that we live in. There's a huge misconception of who we are. You get what I'm saying? So when you think about Moabites, Hittites, Canaanites, Amorites, automatically you start thinking about Bible stories. Who are they?
If they tell you any different, then they tell a lie. Ain't gotta say much, take a look at my eyes. When you grow up in the project, you just try to survive. No right, no wrong, no love at home. Then they wonder why the project baby hold the chrome. Got truth on the track, so I'm not alone. Rewinded one time, so you can vibe alone. 6 years, I'm back, wasn't gone that long.
All my life I had the odds against me. Ever since I was a kid, there was a legend in me. Didn't think that my story mattered. Wanted to rewrite all the chapters.
Committed. Let's go.
Had a voice, but I was scared to use it.
I was.
My biggest fear was thinking I was gonna lose it. Before the world I love was captured by the sun within the disaster.
Dinner with the devil, better check the price. When he goes to leave, you better